A black family walks into a small-town diner, just looking for a peaceful meal, but what they get instead is a cold shoulder from the waitress. She refuses to serve them, not knowing the man sitting at that table is someone who could change not just her view, but the heart of the entire town. What happens next is a journey of regret, redemption, and a lesson that leaves everyone changed. Before we dive into the full story, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below, and let's see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The morning rain tapped gently against the tall front windows of Shirley's diner. The kind of tap-tap-tap that lulled the regulars into slower sips of their black coffee and gave the booths a soft hush beneath the clatter of plates and silverware. Nestled on the corner of Main and Hamilton, Shirley's had been around since the 1950s, and in a town like Brooksville, that meant something. It was where old men nursed bottomless cups of joe while swapping the same stories they'd told for 20 years. Where Shirley herself once walked the floor in her signature red apron and matching lipstick, smiling with the kind of charm only earned through decades of knowing everyone's name and how they took their eggs. She'd passed the place down to her niece, who didn't have the same sparkle, but kept things running well enough. The regulars still came, the walls still held that old grease and maple syrup scent, and the world outside rarely interfered with the slow rhythm inside. That was the world Claire stepped into 3 months ago when she moved back from the city. At 26, with a college degree she didn't use and a heart still recovering from a relationship gone cold, Claire wasn't exactly thrilled to be back in her hometown. But the rent was cheap, the job was waiting, and the town, well, it was familiar at least. Claire had grown up in Brooksville. She knew the faces, the roads, the silences that filled in conversations when something uncomfortable surfaced. She also knew that change didn't come easily here, that people held tight to their habits, their views, even when the world outside had moved on. She tied her blonde hair into a neat ponytail, slipped on the black apron, and clocked in just as the morning rush began to trickle through the door. Her first hour went by in muscle memory, refilling mugs, dropping off menus, scribbling orders without much thought. Her voice had that sweet, practiced lilt of a waitress who smiled even when she didn't feel like it. It was just another Wednesday. That is, until the bell above the door rang, and in stepped a family Claire had never seen before. A black couple, both dressed in quiet Sunday-best elegance, walked in with a young boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, bouncing beside them. The father wore a dark gray suit, pressed and tailored, with a faint gleam of polished cufflinks at his wrists. The mother wore a soft lavender blouse, her hair pulled back in a simple, graceful style. The boy had on a small blazer and khakis, clearly fussed over that morning. They looked calm, composed, and completely out of place in that diner. Claire felt it before she understood it. The tightening inner shoulders, the shallow breath, the flicker of hesitation. Her eyes darted to the counter, to the booth where 2 older men looked up from their breakfasts and then quickly looked away. The usual chatter dipped just slightly. Claire stood there, tray in hand, unsure what she was waiting for. Maybe for someone else to greet them, maybe for the cook to come out, maybe for them to leave. But they didn't. They smiled politely and took a booth by the window. She took a breath and walked over, notebook in hand. "Coffee?" she asked, avoiding eye contact. The father nodded. "Yes, please. For both of us. And some juice for him." He gestured to the boy, who smiled up at her with a friendliness that caught Claire off guard. She nodded, scribbled it down quickly, and turned on her heel without another word. In the kitchen, she set the tray down with more force than necessary. Harold, the line cook who'd worked there longer than most people in town had been alive, raised an eyebrow. "Everything all right out there?" he asked, flipping bacon. Claire shrugged. "Just visitors." Harold didn't push, but his eyes followed her a moment longer than usual. He'd seen more than most folks gave him credit for. When she returned with the drinks, she didn't linger. She placed the glasses down with a distant politeness and left before the boy could ask her anything. At the counter, one of the regulars leaned toward his buddy and mumbled something Claire didn't quite hear, but she could guess the kind. She didn't smile. Not this time. She told herself it was just habit, that she wasn't rude, just busy, that maybe they should have gone somewhere else, somewhere more used to families like that. She didn't say it out loud, but the thoughts moved through her like whispers from an old room she hadn't cleaned out yet. Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the sound of tires hissing along wet pavement was the only noise for a few long minutes. Inside, something had shifted, not loudly, just enough to be felt, like a weight pressing on the walls of the old diner, reminding everyone that the world outside wasn't as far away as they pretended. And in that quiet, as the boy stirred his juice with a straw and the mother gently patted his hand to stop, Claire stood behind the counter, unsure why her hand was shaking. She looked over once more at the family in the booth. The father was watching her, not with judgment, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet knowing that made her breath catch. She turned away again, hoping her shift would end quickly. But something deep in her gut told her this morning was far from ordinary. Something had been set in motion. Something she wasn't ready for. Not yet. The clink of silverware against ceramic plates echoed softly as Claire stood behind the counter pretending to wipe down the already clean surface, her eyes drifting more than once to the booth by the window. The Black family sat quietly, their posture straight, their expressions composed. The father kept one arm resting on the edge of the table, his fingers lightly drumming a rhythm known only to him. The mother busied herself unfolding napkins, smoothing them out in front of her son who had begun tracing shapes on the fogged glass, unaware of the way the room was beginning to lean inward toward their presence. Claire tried to go about her work, tried to steady her breathing, but the air in the diner had changed. It was still and thick now, not with smoke or grease or the scent of frying sausage, but with something far more difficult to name, something unspoken and old, like dust stirred from the corners of a forgotten room. As Claire walked past their booth with a pitcher of coffee, she caught fragments of a sentence from a table nearby, two middle-aged men in denim jackets, one of them shaking his head. "It's just not how things were," one said under his breath, and the other muttered something back that made Claire's stomach twist, though she didn't catch the exact words. She knew the tone well. She'd heard it growing up at her uncle's barbecues, at school under breathy laughs, at church when someone different showed up and sat too close to the front pews. These weren't menacing words. They were more dangerous than that. They were casual, tossed like pebbles, words that shaped the world just enough to keep things the same, to remind those who stepped out of line that they'd been noticed. Claire delivered a plate to another table, then returned to grab the family's order. She took her time, though she knew the kitchen had already plated the food minutes ago. When she finally picked up the tray and made her way to their table, she kept her eyes down and her words clipped. "Here you go," she murmured, setting the plates in front of them one by one. She noticed the eggs weren't the way they'd asked, the toast already going cold. She almost said something, but didn't. The mother offered a gentle, "Thank you," and Claire nodded without meeting her gaze, walking away before the father could speak. She didn't need to hear his voice. She already felt in her spine, steady, quiet, and patient in a way that made her feel seen and not in the way she liked. Back behind the counter, Claire poured herself a glass of water and took a long sip, as if it could wash down the discomfort rising in her chest. Her coworker Shelley, a waitress in her 50s with a smoker's laugh and a heart soft as fresh biscuits, leaned in. "Everything all right, hon?" Claire gave a tight smile. "Yeah, just busy morning." Shelley glanced toward the booth and raised one eyebrow. "They seem nice. Not many families dress up for breakfast these days." Claire didn't answer. Shelley didn't press. But Claire felt the unspoken thing hanging in the air between them. This wasn't just about being busy. This was about something deeper, and both of them knew it. At the booth, the little boy had started coloring on the back of a kid's menu with a red crayon. His laughter, light and sudden, cut through the tension like sunlight through a storm cloud. The mother smiled at him, brushing a curl from his forehead, while the father watched the room. He wasn't scanning it like a tourist or an outsider. He was observing, measuring perhaps, not with fear or suspicion, but with a quiet strength that unsettled Claire more than she wanted to admit. There was something about him, something not just polished but poised, as if every movement he made was intentional. As if he'd been here before, in places like this, and knew exactly how they worked. Claire caught Harold watching too. The old cook stood at the kitchen window, his arms folded, his eyes steady on the booth. When Claire turned, he didn't look away. She held his gaze for a moment, and then looked down, suddenly ashamed, though she couldn't explain why. Harold had always been kind to her. Never said much, but always nodded, always left an extra muffin by the register if he knew she hadn't eaten. And now he was watching her with a quiet judgment she couldn't ignore. It stung more than she expected. Time seemed to slow. The regulars at the counter resumed their coffee talk, but it had lost some of its warmth. The air in the diner remained dense, not with hostility, but with a strange kind of reckoning. Claire knew it wasn't just about one family or one moment. It was about all the small things that added up, the glances not returned, the tones of voice just a little too sharp, the service just a little too slow. She hadn't meant to be rude, she told herself again. She was just following routine, just overwhelmed, just trying to keep the peace. But deep down she knew better. She'd made a choice, even if she hadn't said the words out loud. When the family finally began to eat, they did so with the grace of people who had done this before, navigated spaces where they weren't truly welcome but refused to shrink. The mother spread jam on her toast. The father poured syrup for the boys' pancakes, and their quiet dignity filled the space where friendliness should have been. Claire stood watching them, the ice in her water glass melting slowly. She didn't know what to do with the feeling growing inside her, but she knew it wouldn't go away. And somewhere between the clatter of dishes and the quiet hum of the coffee machine, a thought broke through all the noise. Maybe they weren't the ones who didn't belong. Claire stood in the narrow hallway, just beyond the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter with one hand while the other rested on her hip, fingers tapping an uncertain rhythm against her apron. She kept glancing over her shoulder, listening for any call from the floor, but it was quiet for now, the kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful but pressed in around her ears. From where she stood, she could hear the low murmur of the family talking softly, their voices calm, measured, and patient, like water running gently over stone. She wished she couldn't hear them. She wished they'd already finished and left so the tightness in her chest could finally ease. But they hadn't. They were still there, still present, still disrupting the fragile balance she didn't even realize she had been clinging to. She turned toward the staff break room, a little alcove with a sagging couch and a chip coffee maker that hadn't been cleaned properly in months. Shelley was on a cigarette break outside, and the back door hung slightly ajar, letting in the cool morning air laced with the scent of wet asphalt. Claire muttered under her breath, not loud, but just enough to let the words tumble out before she could catch them. They don't belong here. She wasn't expecting anyone to hear her. The words weren't for anyone but herself, a way to name the discomfort that had been crawling beneath her skin since the moment that family walked in. But someone had heard. Harold stood near the back sink, quietly stacking plates, a dish rag slung over his shoulder. He didn't speak right away. He simply turned, looking at her with an expression that was calm, unreadable, and yet somehow heavier than 1,000 words. Claire froze. Their eyes met, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. The silence between them was thick, charged with something old and rooted deep. Finally, Harold said, "Been here a long time, Claire. Long enough to know when old ghosts come knocking." His voice wasn't angry. It wasn't sharp or accusing. It was sad, and that sadness cut deeper than any judgment ever could. Claire's mouth opened, but no words came out. What was she going to say? That she didn't mean it? That it just slipped out? That she was tired, stressed, overwhelmed? She could have chosen any of those excuses, and maybe she had them lined up without even realizing it. But something about Harold's gaze made her hold her tongue. He turned away then, not out of dismissal, but as if continuing the conversation would cost him something he no longer wanted to spend. He picked up a tray and walked out the swinging door, leaving Claire alone with her thoughts. Back on the floor, the diner had returned to its slow rhythm, customers sipping coffee and chewing through quiet conversations. The family still sat by the window, finishing their meals. The little boy had grown quieter now, leaning into his father's arm as he whispered something that made the man smile. That smile unsettled Claire in a way she couldn't explain. It wasn't smug. It wasn't performative. It was simply real, the smile of a man who knew who he was and didn't need anyone's approval to exist. Claire walked back to the counter, mechanically filling a mug for a regular. Her ears buzzed with the weight of her own words. Words she couldn't take back. Words she didn't even fully understand until Harold looked at her like that. She'd heard them her whole life. In her father's grumbles over the news. In her mother's subtle shifts in tone. In jokes told at school that ended in uneasy laughter. They were always whispers, never shouts, and they were always followed by a shrug, a deflection, a look that said, "That's just how it is." She had inherited those whispers like an old coat, worn, familiar, and long overdue to be discarded. But she hadn't taken it off. Not really. Not until now. Shelley returned from her break, shaking off raindrops from her sleeves, and Claire didn't speak. She couldn't. Something inside her was unraveling. Not in panic, but in quiet revelation. She watched the family stand and prepare to leave, the father adjusting his coat, the mother wrapping a scarf around her shoulders. The little boy slipped his hand into his dad's, and together they walked toward the counter to settle the bill. Claire's heart thudded. She looked at Harold, who now stood near the register. Without a word, he stepped aside, gesturing for her to handle it. Her hands trembled slightly as she rang up their total. The father handed her a credit card and gave a gentle smile. "Thank you," he said. Claire swallowed hard, managed a stiff nod, and processed the payment without speaking. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard longer than necessary, her eyes fixed on the screen as if afraid of what she might see if she looked up. When she finally handed back the receipt, their hands brushed for the briefest moment. His touch was steady, warm, utterly human. He said nothing else, simply turned to walk away with his family. As the door swung open and the soft bell chimed, Claire watched them step back into the drizzle, their umbrella opening with a quiet snap as they made their way down the street. The boy looked back once, caught her eye, and waved. Without thinking, Claire raised her hand in return. Just a small wave. Just enough. Harold approached slowly, arms folded, his expression unreadable. "Words matter," he said. "Even the quiet ones." Claire nodded, her throat tightening. "I know," she whispered. And for the first time that morning, she meant it. The rain had picked up again, tapping in sharper rhythms against the wide front windows of the diner, blurring the view of the sidewalk and washing the street into rippling puddles of gray and silver. Inside, the warmth of the room wrapped itself around the clatter of dishes and the quiet hum of conversations that returned now that the family had paid and gone. Claire stood by the coffee station, gripping the edge of the counter as she tried to steady her breathing, her gaze drifting back toward the window as if expecting them to still be there. But they weren't. The booth was empty now, wiped clean of syrup and crumbs, as if their presence had been erased just as quickly as it arrived. And yet, their absence did not quiet the tremor in her hands or the tight knot in her stomach. If anything, it made it worse. Because now, there was no avoiding the truth that had settled itself into the corners of her mind like rainwater seeping through old wood. He had never raised his voice, never narrowed his eyes, never demanded more than basic respect, and somehow that had unsettled her far more than anger ever could have. She remembered his silence more than his words. The way he had looked at her, not with contempt or challenge, but with something softer and, somehow, heavier. There had been no raised brow, no smirk, no posture of defiance. Instead, there was the steady, grounded stillness of a man who had long since learned that quiet observation could cut deeper than confrontation. That kind of silence didn't come from weakness. It came from a life lived in rooms where one was watched, measured, doubted, and dismissed, and yet, somehow, still chose dignity over bitterness. Claire had seen pride before, the loud kind, the kind that puffed its chest and demanded to be heard. But this man, this father, had worn a different kind of pride, the kind that didn't need to speak loudly because it was already carved into every gesture, every breath, every quiet pause between words. And it had shaken her. She had always thought of herself as fair, as decent, as someone who didn't judge people unless given a reason. But now, all she could see was the way she had hesitated to greet them, the clipped tone in her voice, the way she rushed through their order like she was doing them a favor rather than a job she was paid to do. And the most devastating part was that he had seen all of it. Not just seen, but understood. And still, he had said nothing. Not because he didn't care, but because he had seen it all before. Back in the kitchen, Harold worked silently, the hiss of the griddle and the scrape of spatulas filling the space between them. Claire didn't speak. She didn't know how to, not yet. She wiped down tables, filled ketchup bottles, refilled the sugar holders, doing everything she could to stay moving. But her mind stayed fixed on him, the father with the calm eyes and the firm jaw, who had thanked her despite the way she had made him feel. She had felt his presence like a weight, not because he was imposing, but because he was grounded in something she didn't understand. And now, she wanted to understand it, needed to understand it, but didn't know where to begin. Later that afternoon, when the lunch crowd began to thin and the booths slowly emptied, Claire found herself back at the booth by the window. She stood there for a moment, looking down at the spot where the boy had sat, where the mother had folded napkins and gently stirred her coffee, where the father had rested his arm against the edge of the table, his fingers drumming ever so slightly. She slid into the seat across from where he'd been, and for a brief moment, she closed her eyes and tried to imagine what it must be like to live with that kind of composure. To walk into a room where every glance might hold a judgment. To sit in a booth and feel eyes on your back. To know that your presence alone shifts the air around you. And still to smile. Still to thank the waitress who barely looked at you. The memory of his voice echoed in her mind. Not the words, but the tone. It had been warm, almost gentle, and that had disarmed her more than anything. He hadn't matched her coldness. He had countered it with grace. And that grace had exposed her, not in front of others, but in front of herself. That was what gnawed at her now, what made her stomach churn and her heart ache. Not shame for being called out, but for being seen, really seen, and still being treated with kindness. Claire stayed there longer than she intended, elbows on the table, chin in her hand, watching the rain smear the view outside until the world looked like a watercolor in motion. She didn't know his name, didn't know where he was from, or what he did, or why he'd come to this little town with his beautiful family. But somehow, he had left something behind, something that clung to her like the scent of smoke on a sweater long after the fire had died. And the more she sat with it, the more she realized this was no passing discomfort. This was a reckoning. Harold emerged from the kitchen and glanced at her, but said nothing. She looked up and gave him a nod that was small but sincere. He paused for a moment, then returned the nod before disappearing through the swinging doors again. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't understanding. But it was something. And for now, that was enough. The hush inside the diner had stretched long after the family had gone, as if the very walls had absorbed something they were still trying to digest. Claire stood behind the counter polishing silverware, her hands moving on autopilot while her thoughts spun like a carousel she couldn't step off. She kept seeing his face, his stillness, his eyes, the weight of all he didn't say. Every moment since they had walked through that door was now being replayed in her mind under a harsher light, and no matter how she tried to rationalize or excuse her behavior, the truth kept rising like a tide. She had failed a test she hadn't even known she was taking. And the worst part wasn't what others might think. It was the look Harold had given her, the silent disappointment that hung heavier than any lecture could have. That look had stayed with her longer than the family did, longer than the whispers at the counter, longer than the twisting ache in her stomach. That look said he had expected more from her. The lunch crowd had thinned, and Claire was grateful. Her voice felt too fragile to speak, her smile too thin to offer. She moved about the floor, refilling napkins and wiping tables no one had touched, trying to make herself useful, trying to keep her body busy while her mind was anything but. She heard the door to the kitchen swing open and closed again, Harold's steps slow and deliberate. She didn't look up until she heard the soft clink of a coffee mug placed beside her on the counter. "You look like you could use this," he said. His voice was gentle but firm, like the scrape of worn leather against wood. Claire glanced at the mug, then at him. His face was calm, unreadable, but his eyes still held that quiet weight. "Thanks," she murmured, taking the mug with both hands. The warmth grounded her. They stood in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that hummed with unsaid things. Then Harold leaned a hip against the counter and said, "You know who that man was?" Claire shook her head slowly, afraid of where the conversation might go. Harold let out a breath, not a sigh exactly, but something close. "His name's Marcus Ellison. Worked for the Pentagon, last I heard. Used to be a civil rights attorney before that. Smart, decent man. Grew up not too far from here, though you wouldn't know it. Left when he was barely out of high school. Said he didn't have a reason to come back." Claire felt her cheeks flush. Her fingers tightened around the mug. She didn't know what to say. Her heart thudded like it was trying to climb out her chest. Harold continued, his tone still calm, but carrying a sharper edge now. "Man like that didn't need to stop in this diner. Didn't need to come in here with his family and sit at that booth and give us his time. But he did. And you treated him like a problem instead of a person." Claire winced. The words weren't shouted. That made them hit harder. She stared down at the coffee, too ashamed to look at him. "I didn't know," she whispered, and immediately hated how hollow it sounded. Harold nodded slowly. "That's the thing, Claire. You didn't know because you didn't care to know, and you're not alone in that. A lot of folks in this town walk around with blinders on, thinking if they don't say anything ugly out loud, they're in the clear. But silence has its own language. People hear it. They feel it, especially folks who've had to carry it all their lives." His words didn't come from a place of malice. They came from lived experience, from the steady erosion of trust and dignity over decades of being spoken over, looked through, and pushed aside. Claire felt like she was shrinking beneath them, not because he wanted to make her small, but because the truth was forcing her to confront how small she'd allowed her world to be. She looked up at Harold, her eyes wet. "I didn't mean to hurt them," she said. Harold gave a slow, tired nod, meaning don't always match impact. "You got a good heart, Claire. I've seen it. But good hearts don't mean much if they're too scared to be honest. You want to make this right? You don't start with apologies. You start with understanding." He pushed off the counter and turned to go, then paused, looking back over his shoulder. "You ever wonder why I've stayed here all these years?" Claire blinked, unsure where he was going. Harold chuckled softly. "It ain't the food, I'll tell you that. It's because I keep hoping this place will wake up one day. And every now and then, someone does. Maybe that's you this time." Then he disappeared into the kitchen again, leaving Claire with his words ringing in her ears like bells that refused to stop. She stood there a long while, the mug growing cool in her hands, her heart heavier than it had been in years. But beneath the weight, something else stirred, a flicker, a pull like the first shift of light before dawn. It wasn't clarity yet, but it was a start. That night, long after her shift ended and the lights of the diner had dimmed behind her, Claire sat cross-legged on her small couch in the dim glow of her television, a lukewarm mug of tea forgotten in her hands. The room was quiet except for the low murmur of the news anchor's voice, her words washing over Claire like a soft current that barely registered. Her mind was still back at the diner, back at the booth near the window, back with the family who had, in one quiet visit, unsettled the balance of everything Claire thought she understood about herself. She hadn't told anyone about the conversation with Harold. She couldn't. His words had settled into her like seeds, and she wasn't ready to expose them to anyone else just yet. They needed time. Time to take root. Time to grow into something stronger than guilt. Something closer to change. She wasn't really watching the news. It was just background noise, a buffer between her thoughts and the heavy silence that had followed her home. But then something caught her eye, a flicker of movement, a familiar tilt of the head, the curve of a jawline she hadn't expected to see again so soon. She blinked, leaned forward, and turned up the volume. The anchor's voice shifted tones, now clearly introducing a segment of significance. In national news tonight, we take a closer look at a man whose quiet leadership and tireless advocacy have made waves in the Department of Defense. Marcus Ellison, former civil rights attorney turned high-ranking policy advisor at the Pentagon, has become one of the most influential voices behind key reforms in military family protections and racial equity efforts across armed services. Claire's breath caught. There he was, Marcus, the same man who had sat in her diner booth just hours earlier. The same man whose presence had stirred a discomfort in her she couldn't shake. And now, there he was on her screen, standing behind a podium in a crisp navy suit, his voice calm, measured, full of quiet authority. The kind of voice that didn't need to rise to be heard. She watched, spellbound, as clips rolled of him speaking at hearings, walking the halls of the Pentagon, visiting schools with military children, shaking hands with generals, and comforting widows with equal grace. The news anchor continued, Ellison's personal history, growing up in the rural South, has informed much of his advocacy. In interviews, he often credits his childhood experiences with shaping his perspective on justice, equity, and the value of silent resilience. Claire's eyes welled up. The screen showed a photo now, one of Marcus as a young man, barely 18, standing in front of a faded house with chipped paint and tired porch steps. His eyes, even then, had held that same quiet strength, that unwavering calm. Then another photo, him in court, defending a wrongfully accused teenager. Then another, holding a toddler in his arms at a community event, smiling like the world couldn't shake him no matter how hard it tried. Claire sat frozen, her fingers trembling around the mug. She felt something strange moving through her. Not shame, not exactly. Something deeper. Reverence, maybe. Or humility. Or the unmistakable ache of being wrong about someone in a way that reveals more about yourself than it ever did about them. The segment ended. The news shifted to politics, but Claire didn't hear it. Her thoughts were rushing now, images and moments from the day flooding back with new meaning. His silence, his smile, his son's joy, his wife's grace. None of it had been ordinary. It had all been profound, and she hadn't seen it because she had been too wrapped in the cocoon of her own assumptions. She tried to imagine what it must have felt like for him to walk into that diner, knowing exactly how he'd be received, knowing what might be said behind his back or under someone's breath. And yet he had walked in anyway, not with a chip on his shoulder, not with bitterness, but with dignity. With hope, even. She looked around her small apartment. The familiar furniture, the framed photos, the faint smell of lemon cleaner still clinging to the floor. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. Because now she understood who he was. Not just by title or reputation, but by the choices he made when no one was watching. She had seen him at his most human, on a rainy morning, in a booth by a window, surrounded by stares, and served with indifference. And he'd still left with his head high, his child laughing, his wife smiling. Claire thought about that wave, the one the boy had given her as they left. The small, innocent kindness of a child who hadn't yet learned how the world would try to dim that light. She set down her mug and leaned back, her eyes still on the screen, though it had long since moved on. Somewhere deep inside her, something shifted. This wasn't just about a customer. This wasn't just about a bad day. This was about what kind of person she wanted to be moving forward. Whether she would let this moment pass like rain down a windshield, or whether she would let it sink in and change something real. She didn't know what she'd do yet, but she knew one thing for sure. She would never forget his face. Not because he was on TV, not because he had power or influence, but because he had walked into her world and, with only his silence, held up a mirror she could no longer look away from. The next morning, Claire arrived at the diner earlier than usual, her fingers nervously twisting the strap of her purse as she stepped inside the familiar space that now felt subtly different. The smell of coffee and frying bacon drifted through the air, mingling with the hush of pre-opening quiet that only she and Harold ever really knew. She flicked on the lights behind the counter, watching as the warm yellow glow spread across the old linoleum floor and up the walls covered in decades of faded photos and town memorabilia. It should have felt comforting like it always had, but today it felt like stepping into a place she no longer understood in the same way. She was starting to see it, really see it, for what it had become. Not just a small-town diner with strong coffee and reliable regulars, but a place where history lingered in the silences, where glances carried stories, where the walls remembered more than most were willing to speak aloud. Claire spent the first 30 minutes wiping down tables that were already clean, straightening sugar caddies, and refolding napkins with a precision born not from neatness, but from unease. Harold arrived shortly after, setting his keys down on the counter with his usual quiet rhythm. He didn't say anything at first, just moved past her, tying his apron in the same practice loop he'd done every morning for years. Claire glanced at him, heart thudding like a schoolgirl about to confess to something she couldn't undo. "Harold," she said softly, and he paused, one hand still on the knot of his apron. "I need to ask you something." He turned, brows slightly raised but not unkind, and waited. "Do you think there's any chance, any way I can make it right? Not perfect, not erase it, but just something better?" Harold looked at her for a long moment, then pulled the rag from his shoulder and began wiping down the grill. "Making it right doesn't start with big gestures," he said finally. "It starts with facing the truth and doing better next time. Over and over, even when no one sees it. Especially then." Claire nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the floor. She didn't want to just be better someday. She wanted to begin now. She wanted to find the family, to say something, anything, that might bridge the gap her silence had created. She knew it wasn't about her, not really, but still, the ache wouldn't go away until she at least tried. After her shift, she went straight to the library, something she hadn't done since high school. The building still smelled of paper and dust, still had the same sleepy hum of whispers and turning pages. She sat at one of the public computers and typed his name, Marcus Ellison, into the search bar. Dozens of results came up: articles, speeches, interviews, op-eds. Photos of him shaking hands with military leaders, walking with members of Congress, standing at press conferences with calm dignity. And then, finally, a local mention. A press release about a speaking event at a nearby college. He was scheduled to give a keynote address in 2 days, just one town over. Her heart jumped. It wasn't far. 45 minutes by car. A short drive compared to the weight she'd been carrying. Without letting herself hesitate, she wrote down the date and time, folded the paper carefully, and tucked it into her pocket like a vow. The next day passed in a blur. Every cup of coffee she poured, every plate she delivered, every smile she gave to a regular felt different now. Not performative, but deliberate. She was paying attention in a way she hadn't before. Noticing how people responded to her tone, how they reacted to pauses or warmth or the absence of both. She caught herself slipping once, responding a bit too sharply to a gruff old man who grumbled about the weather, and immediately softened her voice. It was exhausting, but not because it was fake. It was exhausting because it demanded awareness, and awareness was something she'd gone too long without. By the time her shift ended, she was emotionally spent but quietly determined. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the paper with Marcus's speaking event tucked under her pillow like a secret. She wasn't sure what she'd say if she saw him. She wasn't even sure he'd remember her, though something told her he would. It wasn't the kind of experience people forgot easily. But this wasn't about being remembered. It was about showing up, about not letting her silence be the last thing he heard from her. She needed to face him, even if only for a moment, to say something she couldn't say through a receipt or a nod or a wave from a window. On the day of the event, Claire left the diner early, her palms slick against the steering wheel as she navigated winding country roads toward the college campus. The closer she got, the tighter her chest felt, but she didn't turn around. She parked near the auditorium and sat in her car for 5 long minutes before stepping out, smoothing her shirt and walking across the lawn toward the glass entrance doors. Inside, the crowd was polite and professional. Students, faculty, and community leaders. She slipped into a seat in the back row, heart pounding as the lights dimmed and the announcer took the stage. And then, there he was, Marcus Ellison, standing tall behind the podium, his voice steady and warm, speaking not with self-importance, but with conviction shaped by years of experience and quiet battles won. Claire watched him, her breath catching at the calm power of his presence. The way he used stories to draw people in, to invite them not just to listen, but to reflect. He spoke of dignity, of history, of the responsibility we each carry to see one another fully. And Claire felt the weight of those words like they were meant for her and her alone. When the speech ended and the applause swelled, she didn't clap right away. She just sat there, still and overwhelmed, wondering whether she had the courage to do what she'd come for. And as people began to file out, she stood slowly, every step toward the stage feeling heavier than the last, but still, she walked forward. The crowd had thinned to a gentle murmur, polite conversations drifting like autumn leaves across the polished marble of the college atrium. People were mingling, shaking hands, exchanging words about policy and progress, and Marcus Ellison stood in the center of it all with the same quiet poise he had carried in the diner, shoulders square, voice soft but unmistakably firm, his presence more commanding than loudness could ever be. Claire hovered at the edge of the room, feeling both out of place and somehow precisely where she needed to be. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear exactly, but from the weight of everything that had led to this moment. She had rehearsed a dozen versions of what she might say, imagined the best case, the worst case, the indifferent nod he might give if he didn't remember her at all. But none of that mattered now. All that mattered was that she had come. She took one careful step forward, then another, her breath catching as Marcus turned slightly and met her eyes. For a second, time suspended. His expression didn't change, not much, but she saw the flicker of recognition, a narrowing of the eyes, a soft lift in his brow, and behind that, something deeper. He remembered. She stopped in front of him, close enough to speak without raising her voice. "Mr. Ellison," she said, her tone small but steady. "I don't want to take much of your time, but I was hoping I might speak with you, just for a moment." He studied her for a beat, then offered a gentle nod, motioning toward a quieter corner near a row of empty chairs. She followed him there, her steps slow, her pulse a drumbeat behind her ribs. They sat, and for a long moment neither spoke. The room buzzed softly around them, a distant hum that faded as Claire focused only on the man across from her. His posture was relaxed but attentive, the way someone sits when they've been in this position before, when they've learned to expect the uncomfortable and meet it without flinching. Claire clasped her hands together in her lap and exhaled. "You probably don't remember me," she began, though she already knew he did. "I work at the diner, the one just outside of town. You came in the other morning, with your wife and your son." Marcus didn't interrupt. He waited, letting her speak, his silence again not a retreat, but an invitation. Claire swallowed. "I was your waitress. Or, I was supposed to be. But I didn't treat you right. And I've been thinking about it ever since." Her voice cracked, but she didn't look away. "When I saw you on the news that night, saw who you are, what you do, it hit me even harder. Not because of your title or what you've accomplished, but because you sat in front of me with your family, and I couldn't even offer you basic decency." She paused, searching for breath. "And you said thank you anyway. You left without a word of complaint. And that silence, it's been echoing in me ever since." Marcus was still quiet, his hands folded neatly on his knee, his gaze steady but not harsh. Finally he spoke. "What made you come today?" he asked, not accusingly, but with genuine curiosity. Claire blinked, unsure how to answer at first. "I guess. I couldn't live with the version of myself who just let it go. I didn't want that to be the end of the story. Not yours. Not mine." Her voice softened. "I didn't come for forgiveness, though God knows I hope you'll find it in your heart to offer it. I came because I wanted to face you. I wanted to own what I did, or didn't do, and to say I see it now. I see you." There was a long, thoughtful pause. Then Marcus leaned back slightly, his eyes not unkind. "I've walked into a lot of rooms where I wasn't wanted," he said. "A lot of places where people decided who I was before I opened my mouth. Most of the time, I let slide. You learn to, if you want to get through the day. But there's always a cost. Always." Claire nodded, her throat tightening. "And yet," he continued, "you're here. Most people don't show up for this part. Most people keep walking." His voice was calm, almost weary, but edged with something like grace. "So yes, I remember you. I remember the way you looked past me. I remember how my son asked why our waitress didn't smile at us the way she smiled at the other tables. And I remember choosing not to explain it to him because I didn't want to teach him bitterness too young." Claire's eyes brimmed with tears, and she wiped at them quickly, ashamed but also oddly relieved. There was something sacred in the honesty of this moment, in the pain it held and the possibility it offered. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "More than I can say." Marcus gave a slow, thoughtful nod. "I believe you," he said. Then, gently, he added, "But don't just carry the guilt. Carry the lesson. Let it change how you move through the world." She exhaled, the tension in her chest easing for the first time in days. "I will," she said. "I promise I will." He offered a hand then, and she took it, the warmth of his palm anchoring her in the moment. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't erasure. But it was connection. It was enough. As they stood, Marcus glanced back toward the crowd. "My wife's over there somewhere," he said. "And my son. If you'd like to meet them, I think they'd appreciate it." Claire hesitated only a second before nodding. "I like that very much." Claire stood beside Marcus as they wove through the thinning crowd, her pulse steadying with each step, though her palms still tingled from the heat of their handshake. It had not been a grand apology, nor a dramatic confrontation, but something quieter, deeper, more honest than she had ever imagined herself capable of. The kind of moment that didn't erase the past, but softened its edges, allowed something new to grow in the space where shame had taken root. She felt the difference in her posture, the way her shoulders no longer curled inward, the way her voice no longer caught in her throat. She was still nervous, yes, but she was no longer afraid. Not of him, not of herself, and certainly not of what it would mean to meet the rest of the family she had once turned away with nothing more than a glance and a silence. As they reached a small group near the far corner of the room, Claire recognized the woman instantly. There was a grace to her that hadn't faded since the day in the diner, a quiet strength in the way she tilted her head as she listened to someone speak, a kindness that seemed to settle in the air around her like perfume. And beside her, their son, the boy who had smiled despite it all, who had waved goodbye with no idea of the weight he had left behind in a stranger's heart. Marcus gently touched his wife's arm, and she turned with a soft smile that deepened as she caught his eye. Then her gaze shifted to Claire, curious but not wary, and Claire saw the moment recognition began to bloom. "This is Claire," Marcus said simply, "from the diner." There was no bitterness in his voice, no tension in the words. Just fact, just an introduction. His wife paused for a beat, then stepped forward with her hand extended, warmth radiating from her expression. "It's nice to meet you again," she said, and Claire took her hand with both of hers, holding it a moment longer than custom required. "It's more than nice," Claire replied. "It's necessary." The woman's smile didn't falter. "Then I'm glad you came." Claire turned to the boy, who was looking up at her with those same curious eyes, bright and clear and untouched by the cynicism that haunted so many adults. "You waved at me," she said gently, "and I should have waved back." The boy smiled, shrugged in that easy way children do when they're not burdened by the same things grown-ups carry. "It's okay," he said. "You see us now." Claire felt something break open in her chest then, something not painful but freeing, like the first breath after a long time underwater. She knelt beside him, looked him square in the eye. "I see you," she said, "and I'm going to remember you." Marcus's wife rested a hand on her son's shoulder, and together they stood there, not as strangers anymore, but as people who had shared something that couldn't quite be named, but wouldn't be forgotten. After a few more quiet moments, Marcus turned to Claire. "We got to head out soon," he said, and she nodded. "Of course," she replied. "I just thank you for this, for not walking away." He looked at her for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "Keep going," he said. "Let this be the beginning." And with that, they were gone. Claire watched them walk away, hand in hand, the boy skipping a little ahead before doubling back to tug playfully at his father's coat. It was a simple image, one easily missed, but to her it carried the weight of 1,000 unsaid things. Redemption, she realized, was not something granted in a single moment. It was something lived day by day in the choices you made when no one was watching, in the willingness to see, to act, to speak, and above all, to grow. In the days that followed, Claire found herself looking at the world through a different lens. At the diner, she no longer floated through her routine with the detachment she once wore like armor. She engaged. She listened. She made eye contact, not just because it was polite, but because it was human. She started noticing how people shifted in their seats when they didn't feel welcome, how laughter sometimes masked discomfort, how silence could mean far more than words ever could. One morning, an older black couple walked in, unfamiliar faces that might once have earned little more than a half-hearted greeting. But this time, Claire approached their table with genuine warmth, her smile reaching her eyes, her voice gentle and open. She didn't do it for show. There was no audience, no performance. Just two people who deserved her full presence, her respect, her kindness. As she poured their coffee, the woman looked up with a small smile. "We were told this place had good food," she said. "Didn't know it came with good company, too." Claire chuckled softly. "We're working on being better," she replied. "Every day." The woman nodded, and they both returned to their menus, the air between them light and easy. Harold noticed, of course. He saw the changes, the way Claire moved through the room, the way her tone had softened, her pace slowed in all the right places. One afternoon, as she wiped down the counter beside him, he gave a quiet grunt. "You know," he said, "this place might just wake up after all." Claire smiled, not because she needed his approval, but because it meant something to hear it. She had taken a first step, and now she was learning how to keep walking. Change in a small town doesn't come all at once, like a thunderclap or a flood. It creeps in like sunlight after a long storm, gradual, quiet, persistent. At first, no one noticed much difference. The same church bells rang on Sundays. The same men gathered at the gas station to talk football and farming. The same women browsed the same aisles at the grocery store where the produce never seemed quite as fresh as it used to be. But in the heart of that sleepy routine, something had begun to shift, not because of protests or politics or any grand announcement, but because one person in one corner of the town had chosen to wake up, and the ripple had begun. Claire had not set out to change anyone else. She knew better than to think a single apology could cure generations of looking the other way. But what she had discovered, standing face to face with the man she had once quietly dismissed, was that redemption is a living thing. And like anything alive, it needs care and consistency. She didn't talk about what had happened at the diner. She didn't turn her shift into a sermon or her memory into a shield. Instead, she simply lived differently. And others, over time, began to notice. It was in the way she greeted every customer now, with sincerity, not just habit. In the way she paused when someone seemed unsure, or new, or out of place, offering them the same warmth she used to reserve for familiar faces. In the way she listened, really listened, to people's names, their stories, their laughter, and their silence. Harold saw it first, but he wasn't the only one. The regulars began to shift too. Old Man Burke, who used to grumble whenever someone looked like they weren't from around here, stopped short one morning when Claire gently asked if he could move to the bigger booth so a young black family could sit near the window. He started to protest, but she met his eye with such calm resolve that he only nodded and took his coffee with a muttered "Sure, sure." And when the family left, the mother stopped by the counter and said softly, "Thank you." That meant more than you know. It was small, yes, but it wasn't nothing. Word got around, like it always does in places like this. People started coming back who hadn't come in years. One woman, Grace, who had moved to the city after college, brought her children in one Sunday after church and hugged Claire like they'd grown up together. "It's different here now," she said. "I can feel it." And she wasn't wrong. Because once people realize they're truly welcome somewhere, they bring pieces of themselves they used to keep hidden. A town built on sameness begins to stretch and breathe and make room for voices it used to ignore. Claire watched it happen in the way the booths filled with more color, more languages, more stories. She heard it in the laughter that echoed across old linoleum floors and the clink of coffee mugs shared between people who once sat in separate corners. It was in that spirit that Harold decided to hang a new photo on the diner wall. For decades, those walls have been covered with the same black and white snapshots of the town's past. Football teams, parades, 4th of July barbecues. Nostalgia was thick in that place, but it had always been a selective memory. One afternoon, Harold walked in with a framed color photo. In it, Marcus Ellison stood at the front steps of the college auditorium, his son perched on his hip, both of them smiling wide and unguarded. Claire had snapped it on her phone the day she met them again, and when she showed it to Harold, he'd said nothing at first, just looked at it for a long time, then nodded and said, "This belongs here." When he hung it, some folks asked questions. "Who's that?" someone said. "He from around here?" And Harold, wiping his hands on his apron, simply replied, "He is now." They didn't all get it. Some grumbled. Change, even the gentle kind, can still feel like loss to those who never had to stretch. But others smiled, nodded, asked to hear the story. And Claire told it, not in every detail, not to shame or to shine, but to share what mattered. That people can grow, that hearts can open, and that sometimes a second chance doesn't just redeem a moment, it redefines a place. And it wasn't just the diner. It spilled into other corners of the town. The church bulletin started, including local history events focused on voices long ignored. The library added a new shelf called Our Broader Story, filled with authors and narratives that had once felt foreign but now felt necessary. A local teacher invited Marcus to speak at the high school the next time he came through, and he said yes without hesitation. "I think they'd like my son to say a few words too," he'd added, with a wink, and the teacher beamed. Even the town council, slow as molasses in most matters, approved a proposal to host a multicultural fair in the summer. It wasn't revolutionary, but it was a start. For Claire, the changes weren't loud. They were in the quiet nods she exchanged with new faces, in the warmth that settled when people lingered a little longer after their meal. She had never thought of herself as brave. Not before all this. But now, when she looked in the mirror, she saw a woman who had chosen to be awake, who had dared to let discomfort crack her open instead of harden her, who had learned that humility isn't weakness, it's the doorway to belonging. And as the days stretched on, as the diner walls caught more voices, more stories, more light, she found herself smiling not just because it was good for business, but because it was good for her soul. The community was still growing, still learning. But so was she. And in the hum of plates and coffee and conversation, in the echo of laughter where once there had been only silence, Claire understood something simple and true. Change doesn't always begin with the loudest voice. Sometimes it begins with a single moment, a single mistake, and the courage to make it right. It was a spring morning when Marcus returned. Not with cameras or fanfare, not in a suit or behind a podium, but just as a man, a father, a husband, stepping quietly back into the place where once, months ago, he had been met with silence and suspicion. This time, the air was different. The light through the diner windows was softer somehow, golden and alive, catching the steam from coffee pots and dancing along the chrome edges of the counter. Outside, the dogwood trees were just beginning to bloom, their delicate pink petals drifting in the breeze like promises made good. Claire was already behind the counter when she saw them. First, the small figure of a boy, taller now, bounding up the steps two at a time, his laughter rising before the bell above the door could even ring. Then came his mother, graceful as ever, followed by Marcus, whose eyes caught Claire's the moment he crossed the threshold. He smiled, and it wasn't the polite smile of a man tolerating a space that once excluded him. It was warm, rooted, real. Claire stepped out from behind the counter, wiping her hands on her apron, heart fluttering with something between joy and disbelief. She had hoped they might return one day, but she hadn't expected it to feel like this, so natural, so right. "You came back," she said, and her voice cracked slightly around the edges. Marcus nodded. "We promised our son pancakes," he said with a soft chuckle, "and he never forgets a promise." The boy grinned and tugged his father's hand toward their old booth near the window. Claire gestured with a smile. "Your table's waiting." As they slid into the booth, Claire noticed how other patrons looked up, some in recognition, some in curiosity, but none with the cold distance of before. Instead, there were nods, smiles, a small wave from a woman across the room who had once asked if those people belonged. Even she had changed, or was trying. And in a town like this, even trying was something to hold on to. Claire brought menus, though she knew they probably wouldn't need them. "Still like extra syrup?" she asked the boy, who lit up. "Yes, ma'am," he beamed. "And no bananas." She winked. Got it. As she turned to head back to the kitchen, Marcus gently touched her elbow. Claire, he said softly. She turned. Yes. He didn't speak right away. He just looked at her, really looked, and then nodded like he saw all of it. What had been, what was now, what might still be. Thank you, he said simply. And though she had heard those words from countless mouths over the years, they had never landed quite like this. They filled something in her she hadn't even known was still hollow. The meal was easy, laughter spilling across the booth like sunlight on old wood. Claire checked in often, but never hovered, sensing that the best kind of service now was the kind that offered space without absence, presence without intrusion. Other guests began to approach, some to introduce themselves, others to thank Marcus for his work, for his words, for simply returning. He received them all with the same calm grace, never puffed up or distant, just open. And as the boy told a joke to the couple in the next booth and drew giggles from a toddler waving a spoon like a flag, Claire saw it all with a kind of awe. This was what community looked like, not in theory, but in motion, in the messy, beautiful act of becoming something better. As the family stood to leave, Claire brought over a small paper bag. For the road, she said. Extra pancakes, just in case. The boy hooped with delight, clutching the bag like treasure, and his mother touched Claire's arm gently. You made this place feel like home, she said. Claire's eyes welled with tears. You helped me remember what home really means. Marcus stepped forward, holding out his hand, but Claire took it in both of hers, then surprised even herself by pulling him into a brief, heartfelt embrace. You changed more than you know, she whispered. More than I can ever say. He pulled back, smiling. Change takes two sides, he said, and a bridge between them. They walked out into the sunshine, the door swinging closed behind them with a soft chime. Claire stood for a moment, watching them go, then turned back to the counter where new customers were trickling in, where coffee was still brewing, where Harold was already making a fresh batch of hash browns. She tied her apron tighter, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and got back to work. Not because things had gone back to normal, but because they hadn't. Because normal had never been good enough, and now she knew what better looked like. It looked like second chances, like hard conversations, like small hands waving from a booth near the window. It looked like community, not as it was, but as it could be. That afternoon, as she refilled salt shakers and wiped down menus, Claire glanced at the photo wall. Her eyes settled on the one of Marcus and his son, framed now in a wooden border Harold had carved himself, placed right between the old parade snapshot and a new picture of the town's first multicultural fair. She smiled. The wall had changed, just like the town, just like her. And as the bell over the door rang once more, ushering in a breeze that smelled of honeysuckle and promise, Claire knew this wasn't the end. It was a beginning that had come full circle, not in spite of the past, but because of it. And that brings our story to a close. A story not just about a waitress or a family, but about how small moments of courage can ripple outward and change everything. If this story moved you, made you think, or reminded you of something from your own life, we hope you'll take a moment to reflect, to share, and to keep these conversations going. Thank you, truly, for spending your time with us today. Your attention, your heart, and your presence mean more than you know. We're honored to have had you with us for this journey. If you enjoyed the story, please give this video a like. It really helps others discover it. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another powerful story like this one. We post regularly, and each tale is crafted with care just for you. We'd also love to hear from you. Has something like this ever happened in your life? Have you ever witnessed or been part of a moment that changed someone's heart or your own? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. We read every single one, and your voice is an important part of this community. Until next time, take care of yourself and those around you. And remember, every small act of kindness counts.